All right, we're good? Hello everyone, thanks very much for coming to this, which I think might be the 12th Kleptoscope, but I've slightly lost count. Kleptoscope, for those of you who haven't been to one before, is an event that we do here to discuss all things which I decide are tangentially related to kleptocracy. We sort of started off talking about London property because it grew out of the kleptocracy tours, which we used to run in West London, pointing out properties that belong to kleptocrats. And it's sort of slightly taken flight, and now, yeah, like I say, anything I've decided is vaguely kleptocrat related is fair game. So this evening we're talking about a very British kind of censorship, which is the misuse of defamation proceedings to muzzle journalists, muzzle book writers, muzzle anyone who's interested in writing about what's really happening, and in the interests of not exposing the misdeeds of the rich and unscrupulous. I have to declare an interest. About 3 years ago, approximately, I was sitting right here explaining to an audience who looked a bit like you, but not nearly as good looking, that I wasn't able to show them a film about corruption in Ukraine, owing to the fact that just before the film was due to be shown, we were contacted by lawyers for a Ukrainian businessman, shout out to anyone from Peters and Peters in the house, to inform us that if we did, we would lose everything we owned. Anyway, that's not going to happen tonight. So directly to my right is Claire Rucastle-Brown, who in 2010 founded the Sarawak Report and Radio Free Sarawak, initially to publicise illegal deforestation and illegal logging operations in Sarawak, which is, of course, in part of Malaysia. And later, the focus of her journalism expanded to include the 1MDB scandal, which is one of the most extraordinary acts of kleptocracy that the world has ever seen, if not actually the most extraordinary act. She is still banned from entering Sarawak, obviously, but your work has helped contribute to the downfall of government and to criminal cases in many jurisdictions, including the United States, but not including the United Kingdom as yet. On my extreme right, or your extreme left, is Bradley Hope, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, Pulitzer Prize nominee. Nominee or winner? Nominee. So far, not a winner. Based here in London, and author of The $1 Billion Whale, which is a book about the 1MDB scandal and its kingpin, Joe Low, who is currently in China, we think. Yeah. Currently in China, having had an absolutely astonishing run of spending other people's money, including on perhaps the most extravagant party I've ever read about in Las Vegas. That book is not published here in the UK for reasons that we will come on to. Between Claire and Bradley is Rupert Cooper-Coles, media lawyer, solicitor, and man who has done an awful lot of work with Claire in the past to try and defend her from the legal stratagems of the powerful and the wealthy. We're going to start with Claire. Could you tell us a little bit about 1MDB and a little bit about Sarawak and Malaysia more generally, just so in case there's anyone here who isn't on the same page?
Yes, well, I suppose briefly, I got stuck into looking into Malaysian corruption because at grassroots level, I've seen the effect that it had on ordinary people and on our planet. I had been born in Sarawak and had grown up in East Malaysia, which is home to the Borneo jungle, which is one of the most fabulous and important places on Earth. And this was taken out effectively, cashed in, on behalf of a very small number of people. These were the kleptocrats in East Malaysia, and I realised that it was an act of criminality. This was not done as a sensible government decision to develop the country. And I felt, as a matter of conscience, I was actually no longer fully employed at that time. I was bringing up my two boys who are here, and so I had that little bit of time to devote to this subject I thought was incredibly important. And so I started that blog. I took advantage of the internet, did a masses of exposés about these two local rulers, but realised that I wasn't actually going to get anywhere, despite a lot of impact I was having on people's popular opinion, because the central government was clearly corrupt. And I started inevitably to look to the source of that corruption. Who was the Prime Minister, the federal government in Malaysia at that time, was totally corrupted after 6 decades of uninterrupted power and very, very extensive centralised power. They could do what they liked. So it's a classic kleptocrat situation. And at that point, I started to look at some of the more blatant corruption linked to Prime Minister Najib. And I guess I got my break at the end of 2013 with a Hollywood movie, actually, the $100 million Wolf of Wall Street, starring Leo DiCaprio. And I learnt that it was being produced by Najib's stepson, who had no obvious means of wealth to fund a $100 million movie. So I started looking at that and realised that his constant companion was this chap that I'm sure Bradley will talk a little bit more about, Joe Low, who was well known to Malaysians already by that time for being both the architect and main player of a development fund that the Prime Minister had set up, known as 1MDB, which had been much criticised because it was borrowing billions of dollars on the taxpayer at huge and inexplicably high rates of interest, and yet it was failing to do the basic accounting on where that money was being invested. And Joe Low was known for being Najib's sidekick on that project, and he was also known for being a sort of tabloid-catching big spender. So the stories about Joe Low's extraordinary spending had started to circulate, from the hotspots in LA and Las Vegas and Saint-Tropez, and everyone in Malaysia knew that this guy was by now known as a billionaire. So I wrote an article asking whether the disappearance of all that money from 1MDB had anything to do with the funding of the Wolf of Wall Street.
Bradley, did it have anything to do with the funding of the Wolf of Wall Street? And a little bit about there's this amazing bit in your book when you quote a convicted money launderer who attends one of Joe Low's parties and says, there is no way that someone who earned this money honestly would be spending money like this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was, I think, somebody with an eagle eye like Claire could see right away something was wrong. I think it took the rest of the world a long time to really figure it out. Although I have to say, one of my favorite anecdotes is in page 6 in the New York Post, which covers celebrities and stuff. There was this very ominous quote, which was, "Nobody spends their own money like that." So in a way, I have to give them credit. They kind of nailed it from the beginning, and it turned out that was the case, And I think, in general, criminals can kind of notice other criminal activity. So Jordan Belfort was sitting there, and he could see something funny.
Jordan Belfort was the Wolf of Wall Street.
Yeah, the actual Wolf of Wall Street. He was sitting there thinking, there's no way you spend your own money like this, so it just turns out a lot of what Claire was figuring out, it all proved to be true, So there's this absolutely complex and elaborate system of which they funneled all this money away from 1MDB, and the Wolf of Wall Street was $100 million budget. I would say at least the majority of it was funded by the money from 1MDB, and it went via the British Virgin Islands.
Inevitably. Before we get on to the subject of the evening, can you just mention a few of the other institutions involved in this astonishing act of kleptocracy?
Well, so you've got Goldman Sachs. They helped raise the money at 1MDB. 1MDB was a very strange fund because when you think of a sovereign wealth fund, you typically think of one of these oil savings accounts for Norway or Abu Dhabi. But this was a kind of a new breed of sovereign wealth fund where all the money was borrowed with kind of the state backing the debt. And so what happened was they started borrowing money first locally in Malaysia. They borrowed from as many banks as they could. And then when they really wanted to hit the prime time, they called in Goldman Sachs, who had a relationship with some of these guys in Sarawak and other places that he kind of, there's an overlap. And so Goldman Sachs helped them raise $6.5 billion.
Billion with a B.
Yeah, and most of that was stolen, I guess you could say. 600 million of it went to Goldman Sachs for their labor, which is an extraordinary fee. I mean, typically when a bank helps someone raise a bond, which is a pretty straightforward process, it's more like 1%. But in this case, it was closer to 11%, and that's why that's one of the things we're all waiting for, Claire and I especially, is what's going to happen to Goldman Sachs, because they're really under the gun in the U.S. Some of the other big ones, lots of Swiss banks and private banks all over the world, Coutts and BSI and Falcon Bank,
Coots is, of
Standard
course,
Chartered.
Coots is owned by us, right?
Yeah.
It's RBS, so it's a state-owned.
Standard Chartered. And then one of my favorite ones, though, is the law firm. So one of the things that Jolo did, and this is this incredible thing, is there's something in America called an IOLA account, which is it's this kind of an account that, so let's say let's say that you're going to buy some real estate and you give some money to your lawyer. It's not, they decided it wasn't right that lawyer would be earning interest on your money. So they decided to put it into an account where the interest is sent to help pay for people who don't have lawyers. But it turns out it's also one of the greatest money laundering tools available to mankind. Because, and this is what Jolo did, he found Sherman and Sterling, which is like one of the great white shoe law firms. He transferred huge amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, into their IOLA account, and the interest was going to pay for these people who needed lawyers. And then he would transfer the money from there to all these other places. And anybody trying to do their due diligence says, well, I don't know, this came from Sherman and Sterling. There's nothing else we can find out about this. It's Sherman money. What other kind of entities out there? All the accounting firms. At least 3 of the big 4 accounting firms were checking the books of 1MDB. And whenever somebody raised a question, they just fired them and hired the next one. And eventually they, I don't think you could say any of them did a particularly good job or raised any red flags.
And in the Middle East?
Yeah, in the Middle East we have one of Abu Dhabi's biggest sovereign wealth funds, which has now kind of disappeared, largely in part in relation to this. The royal family of Abu Dhabi, the royal family of Saudi Arabia, all these Hollywood stars, all the rappers, So it's quite a character list.
So if you choose to write about this story, you're picking a fight with the government of Malaysia, Goldman Sachs, the royal family of Saudi Arabia, the royal family of Abu Dhabi, Sherman and Sterling, and a number of smaller players. It's quite a significant enemy list just to out of the blocks. So how do they respond? So getting onto the theme of the evening, legally, how do they respond to you, Claire?
Well, I never felt I was. Well, they first responded illegally, and I think what's interesting. I mean, I can't think of anything they didn't try and do really, apart from bump me off. So I've had we've been exchanging sort of anecdotes of how jolly it is when So I've had hacking, I've had people stalking, I've had attacks on my website and on my radio station, and again, my sons lived through a sort of period where it's sort of weird. There was always a sort of kind of slightly bald, spiky head kind of guy that would always be sitting next to me in the coffee shop or following along the road. And eventually I had to go to the police about that. But, that was nothing to me compared to the legal onslaught. Because that, I kept away from Malaysia, obviously, where very brave people were facing sort of death and far worse, an arrest and so forth. But I was obviously doing what I was doing on behalf of them safely here. But when the lawyers came after me, obviously, it's existential. They can cost you so much, effectively. And I've had endless, onslaughts by lawyers.
So when the lawyers come after you, for those of us who that hasn't happened to, how does that manifest itself?
Well, you get a sort of kind of preposterous letter, don't you? Sort of designed to sort of terrify the wits out of you. I mean, look, I have to be honest about this. I had 20 years working as a mainstream journalist, so an investigative journalist in powerful organisations. So I was used to receiving these letters, and normally I would have someone wonderful like Rupert, who was part of that organisation, who would be at my back. But this occasion, obviously, I was just an individual, so I was less terrified by these letters, which the first thing they do is accuse you of saying something you haven't. They exaggerate and take to the furthest end what you very carefully tried not to say, to be honest, and then they'll basically tell you that their client is massively rich, and that you will lose everything unless you grovel, apologise, admit you're wrong, etc. And I had one last bit of parting good advice, and I think I'll mention who it came from. It came from a company, from a law firm known as Schillings, actually, and one of their
with a C, if you want to Google it.
Someone in Schillings had told me, with regard to another letter I'd had from the Taib family of Sarawak, from Mishkon Dorea, the best thing to do with this sort of letter is file it in the bin, because you'll save yourself a fortune, because once you get involved in interacting, I'm going to do you a favour, Claire, and I'm not going to take on this case it's not going to go anywhere. So for a number of these letters I got, I filed them in the bin, about 10 separate letters. But then, of course, if they decide that actually they're really going to go after you and they file a writ, then you have to ring up someone like Rupert. And I've just got out of one case which was entirely vexatious, and I can explain why it was, because the guy's admitted it now, and he's facing a nasty jail sentence himself, I think, in Malaysia. I ended up with the best part of £500,000, even before proceedings opened in court, and that was just vexatious to and fro between lawyers, and I stood my ground because I had to. Because if I hadn't, basically in advance of the Malaysian election, I would have been forced to say that the Prime Minister was innocent and 1MDB was a lie. So I personally couldn't bring myself to do that, and that's why I was in this terrible situation.
Rupert, I think a lot of us thought that libel tourism was solved. I mean, it was widely thought that, with the legal changes and so on, 6-7 years ago, everything was better. What's happening here? What are we seeing here?
Well, it's not solved at all. The only there was a big hoorah about changing our libel laws in 2013 to make them safer for journalism, to protect public interest journalism. But the only libel tourism provision in the Act they brought in 2013 stops people suing foreign publishers unless you can show that this is the right jurisdiction to sue in. So any journalist writing from Britain, any news organisation, anyone with a link to Britain can be sued just as easily as before. And so any foreign politician, any kleptocrat in any country, if you're writing about them from this jurisdiction, the assumption is in the online world that they'll have some sort of reputation in this jurisdiction which can be sued upon, particularly if they're a politician. And they can bring proceedings here, and so that by the time you get that first, it's called a letter before action. A partner at Shillings or Carter-Ruck has been working on it for maybe 5 hours at £500 an hour. Few associates, they might already have £5,000 on the clock, and that's already a sledgehammer. That's already that very first letter says, give us an apology, take down the article, and pending the speed of your response and how forthright your apology is and how grovelling it is, we'll take a view on whether we'll get those £5,000 damages and whether we'll sue you for £200,000 for the libel that we say you've published. No, it's very, very easy to sue any British journalist here, and libel tourism by foreigners wanting to sue journalists here hasn't been deterred at all. It's very much alive.
Bradley, you are obviously working for an American publication. You are not British yourself. When you became aware, I'm wondering how this contrasts with the situation in the United States.
Well, the law is dramatically different. In the United States, journalists don't really worry about libel all that often because basically, in order to prove a libel case, not only must you be wrong, but you have to have been wrong on purpose in order to hurt the person with false information. So you have to have malice.
So not only do they have to show you're wrong, but they have to prove that you were deliberately wrong.
You did it on purpose. Yeah, if you get something terribly, terribly wrong and it hurts someone, it still doesn't mean that you're going to win a libel case, And also the burden of proof is switched around as well. So they have to prove everything, and whereas here is the other way around. And I think what makes it especially difficult here is that sometimes you write an article that's based on anonymous sources who are very well placed, and maybe you have multiple of them, so your paper feels confident in the information that you're publishing. But if you were to go to court, how would you go about doing that? It would be very difficult. You'd have to unmask your sources, which is an unconscionable breach of your agreement with them. So for a lot of the 1MDB case, I was based in New York until the last 2.5 years. So we didn't have to really think about the UK aspect, but increasingly, well, now that I'm based here, and our newspaper is registered here, so I have to basically follow the same rules here, and everyone threatens us here now. So
And so your book has not yet been published in this country, though we hope it will be.
yeah.
Has that? I mean, it's an amazing book, and we're telling an incredible story. But it's not unusual. I mean, sadly, it happened to Karen Dawisha. It's happened to other people that they've written these extraordinary books which have not been published in the UK.
Yeah.
This is directly a defamation thing.
Well, actually, I think it's really shows the seamy underside of this industry, because what happened is we didn't have a publisher here, but a sister publisher of our publisher in New York was going to just distribute it here, not publish it here, but distribute the American
It should
copy.
be said you can buy it from Amazon.com.
Yeah.
Should anyone want it? I'm not saying you should, but.
So these different lawyers, so for different parties, including Shillings for Joe Low, they would never engage. You know, maybe I would say 8 months or maybe a year before the book came out, we sent them like a many page thing with all of the things that were going to go in the book, and they never answered one question, not even Joe Low's age, or spelling of his name. You know, so then they were just silent, and then they started this whole campaign where I mean, this is clearly somebody thought they had a brilliant idea, where they started sending letters to every single bookstore. And I think also for Claire, they did a similar thing. They said every single bookstore, like across the UK, across all English-speaking countries in the world, except for America, where they know there's no point, but Australia, Hong Kong, everywhere. They would have got a list of every English bookstore, and they said, if you publish this book, we will sue you as the bookstore. And then they went to Amazon. And they said, we're going to sue you, Amazon, as well, if you distribute it through your website and if you include a description of it on your website. And what's amazing about that is, if you're so the publisher, obviously all the publishers were scared off, and same for Claire. Claire had to publish it herself, and all the publishers were scared off because they thought, am I going to get 100 legal letters on day one, and how am I going to make any money on this book? You know, and what I find particularly dishonest, though, was in the letters to the bookstores, they were telling them that they could sue the bookstore for distributing the book, where the 2013 Revised Libel Law Act says very specifically, you may not sue a bookstore. It says it like clear as day, unless there's no other remedy. You know, if you're really if they live on the moon or something, I guess, then, and I'm right here, so you can sue me. But it seemed to work. It scared everybody off, but. We're hopeful. We found a publisher, Australian publisher, that was willing to take on the task. So we'll see, maybe by the end of the year.
Just because Rupert, it seems that what we're talking about is the threat of legal proceedings is proving so scary. It's the cost of potentially facing legal proceedings. It isn't just legal proceedings per se. It's the cost of maybe, you know, there's a sort of muzzling effect of just the threat of it.
Yeah. So if you get one of these letters and you decide to get legal advice from a lawyer on what will happen if you're sued, in a nutshell, you probably face 2 years of 1 to 2 years of intensive litigation. If you're running a substantive truth defense, you're trying to back up that what you're saying is true. It's very witness heavy. It can involve a 2-week trial. The claimant's costs will probably be double your own costs. In Claire's big case, Carter put in a budget for about near on 1.5 million. If the case falls apart, if your defense falls apart, which it can for very technical legal reasons, the judge finds that the meaning is the single meaning which the words carry is higher than you thought, so you can't stand up what you meant to say. You face paying hundreds of thousands of pounds of damages if you've caused financial loss, any financial loss you've caused, picking up your own costs and picking up north of £1 million in the other side's legal fees. So you believe in your story, but do you believe it to the extent where you want to roll the dice on your house, on becoming a bankrupt if you lose? And so that's the decision. That's quite a stark decision which journalists have to face. And my boss very brashly told Claire in one of our first meetings that he'd never had a client have to sell the house before. 3 months later, I think your husband was getting bankruptcy advice in case things did go wrong. But it all worked out well in the end.
Yes, luckily I believed him.
Let's hear about that meeting from your perspective.
Well, they're great lawyers, and I, thank God they lifted me off the floor on this. But my real anxiety, as Rupert will know so well, was that this was a foreign litigant that actually issued the writ, and he was a secret ally of the Prime Minister, who had by then been thoroughly exposed for being a massive kleptocrat and needed this religious extremist party to help him, as he saw it, get through the impending election. So I had touched on that he was wooing this party that had up till then been an opposition to the government. So basically what I was facing was a situation that even if I won the case, I couldn't see how I was ever going to get my money from this vexatious litigant, because he was the best friend secretly, as I've now been able to expose. They admit they were in cahoots now, but he was the best friend of the Prime Minister, who was basically trying to get me. So this was my first sort of question to my lawyers, what do I do? And it emerged that I couldn't get a security for costs because Malaysia was considered, we had some kind of treaty with Malaysia, and it was considered to be a friendly country. There wasn't much effort put in to establishing the nuts and bolts of the case.
Just to check, a security for costs is to make sure that they don't scarper and don't pay.
They put the money into the British court system.
Yeah.
And so if I win, I get my money. And I was basically left to whistle in the wind. I was going to have to go to Malaysia, where, of course, I was banned, actually, and there were warrants out for my arrest, and they'd put a red notice alert out on me and describe me as a terrorist to Interpol. So, I was going to have to go to that country where the Prime Minister, hated my guts and regarded me as the person who was threatening his political power, which was what eventuated, thank goodness, in this case, because that was the only way that I was able to maintain myself. In fact, the government losing power was what it took for me to be able to actually prevail in this case.
So the precise allegations that they were suing over were in relation to the connections between...
I had indicated correctly that the Prime Minister's party was supporting this separate party financially in a secret and covert way. And
then you were contacted by Shillings, acting on behalf of...
No, the Shillings issue was the book.
Okay.
This was Carter-Ruck, another friendly face.
Yes, Carter-Ruck, which I believe Private Eye refers to by a different name. Carter-Ruck then contacted you with a letter?
Thunderous letter, yes. Which there's a thing called the pre-action protocol, and Rupert can tell can explain how if you engage in the pre-action protocol, which is basically that £5,000 letter that Rupert's referred to, then you're hooked in. Then you have to start hiring your own lawyer. You have to start spending hundreds of thousands, it can come to at least tens of thousands, just writing rude letters to each other. So I don't have that money, and so I had this habit of filing these letters. Yeah. But you see, lawyers who've got lots of influence in the House of Lords have dealt with this vexatious little solution to cases that litigants don't really expect to bring to court, by getting this pre-action protocol given a sort of legitimacy, in that it's now been passed, and Rupert can explain better, but if it does come to court and you haven't interacted in this expensive way, then that's held against you in the court case. So that's a big fat black mark against you for not having enough money to answer these letters in the first place. So you shouldn't be allowed to speak out if you don't have enough money to engage in the pre-action protocol.
Rupert, can you talk about how you first became involved with working with Claire then? In that, how does this compare to the normal run-of-the-mill case that you're up against?
Well, I mean, the starting point. I came back from holiday, and my partner, the head of our team, said there's a new case involving Malaysian corruption. I've volunteered you for it, Rupert. And
you were aware.
And over the next 2 weeks, I think I got about 1,000 emails from Claire with the background to this huge scandal, which, the more you read into it, the more unbelievable it becomes. The stealing $6 billion with the help of Goldman Sachs isn't enough. If parties with Kanye West and Paris Hilton and producing films and giving a glass piano to Miranda Carr. This is all things Joe Lowe, detailed in Bradley's book, has done. You then delve into the sort of shadier side of the even shadier side of what lies behind Najib, and you. I don't know whether you'd want to talk about it, Claire, but sources ending up in concrete barrels who've risked their lives to pass information sort of out of Malaysia, people disappearing. When in January 2015, Claire and other and a few newspapers around the world exposed this theft, and then in the middle of 2015, they exposed the fact that 700 million from this theft had ended up in the Prime Minister's account. Malaysia's democracy really was within sort of 3 months was on a knife edge. The Attorney General, who was preparing criminal charges against the Prime Minister, got sacked. There was a sort of Stalin-esque purge of anybody who accused the Prime Minister of being connected with 1MDB. Claire's website got banned. Malaysian publications that had covered 1MDB got suspended. And so the whole of Malaysia was terrified of speaking out about this scandal. And it was, it's been growing very, very slowly over the 4 years to the point where we are now. And only since the collapse of the corrupt regime, for the first time in 50 years, last May, midway through our case, the ruling party in Malaysia got voted out in a shock landslide election. Only since then has the tide been turning the other way. I mean, it looked like this was all going to sort of go away, and that for a very long time.
So Bradley, could you talk about that a bit? Because this is very much the kind of London end of a silencing of discussion, which is much more brutal in Malaysia itself. The difficulties that the sources that who spoke to you and who speak to Claire face in Malaysia and have faced in Malaysia.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the beginning it was very tense. All of those guys were risking their lives in various ways, and there was a lot of journalistic tradecraft that people had to use, meeting outside the country as much as possible and that sort of thing. There was one point where the co-writer of the book, he decided to go back into Malaysia thinking they wouldn't mess with him, and there was I got a phone call from one of our sources saying that they were at his hotel, they were thinking about arresting him and stuff, and we never went back again until after the elections. But we tried our best to just, there was obviously, from Claire's experience, there was hacking, there was so many millions of dollars being spent to try to prevent this thing from exploding in a full view, and they were trying every different effort, from PR firms up the wazoo to lawyers and hackers, and in one case I think there was a fake police officer involved with Claire and her whistleblower who pretended to be a Scotland Yard detective, so we just tried our best to practice pretty simple tradecraft, which is always use encrypted mechanisms for speaking and trying to meet outside the country, and but it was definitely, there was a period of time when it was very fraught and tense.
Because that's quite alarming, Rupert, isn't it? Because it does suggest that the British defamation proceedings is the kind of tip of an iceberg of silencing people, which looks quite respectable in this country, but it looks pretty bleak in other parts of the world. I mean, it's a sort of bit of a disturbing thought from the perspective of someone who's attached to the rule of law, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think foreign politicians like to sue in this jurisdiction because our legal system's respected. You know, you get an English judge saying you've been defamed, and you've got a judgment that you can wave around the world. You've got a judgment that if people are republishing that other newspapers will respect. They've sued once, they've proven their point. The legal teams look at that and they go, well, they'll sue again and they'll win again. You know, content providers, Facebook, social media, when they start seeing a court order, they'll take stuff down. So we've got a respected jurisdiction, which kleptocrats like. They're not spending their own money, so the cost of English lawyers is a great sledgehammer to scare the journalists, and it's stolen money, so it's no water off their back, and I mean, it's something we were talking about just before we came up here, but in terms of professional bodies, our money laundering checks, and as far as the English law firm's concerned, they have to get your passport and they have to get your address. But then if you say that it's not true, that you're a kleptocrat and you're corrupt, you're entitled to legal representation. And unless you've got really quite concrete evidence that the fees you're being paid is dirty money, you're in the clear. That's about as far as the obligation goes. So it's very easy for people to come over here, and it's a lot of these publications could be sued in their local countries, but they like to come to Britain. We're a respected jurisdiction, and it carries weight. One court order here or one apology here, and that's a very handy thing to wave around.
Well, and let's make the point. Shillings has been identified by the FBI as receiving its money probably from 1MDB. They're certainly investigating that. So the money that's been used to silence our books has been identified as probably having come from 1MDB by the FBI.
I suspect they deny that.
I'm sure they deny it.
So I just thought I'd get that on the record.
Yeah, no, but there was a statement that by the FBI that the likelihood was, and other lawyers too who've been receiving money from Jolo.
Yeah. This court case is you won, right?
They decided that actually, as the April Fool's Day start of our court case drew near, that they would try and see round the back whether I was amenable to a settlement.
Were you?
Only if they paid me the majority of my legal fees. Right. So it was a prolonged process, but in the end they did. Although they've been pretending for a while that they didn't, but I think the latest as of yesterday is they've admitted they did.
Okay. So we are, with this case, as far as you're concerned, up to now we're done?
We're done. I mean, they didn't want to fight this out in court. I mean, I'd been digging away. The good thing about it taking 2 years is it gives someone like me enough time to go around and start getting your truth defence pulled together. Yeah. So I hadn't mentioned the name of the person who was suing me. So I was in this kind of sort of Kafka-esque situation where I'm being told by Carter Ruck that I have, insulted someone whose name I didn't even mention and accused him of this, that, and the other. And I then sort of actually had to go around and prove he'd done it. And I got near enough to that to chase them out of not wanting to go to court.
I've been previously written articles that have not been published because of the risk of being sued. And I'm aware of other journalists who've done the same. When you've worked for ages on a story, and then the publication's decided it's not worth taking the risk. You probably have quite an interesting insight in the kind of things that don't get published, right? It's an alarming thought that there is a world of news out there that isn't appearing, that isn't being published because of the potential threat of legal proceedings. So it's a sort of pre-censorship a very British form of censorship,
Yep.
right? I mean, it's not
Yeah.
a great situation to be in.
So how it works is, if you want to publish an allegation that damages somebody's reputation, in order to get a public interest defence, one of the main criteria they look at is, have you given the subject of the allegation a fair opportunity to comment on that allegation? So, when you're writing, what a fair opportunity is depends on how serious the allegation is, but it means that they're tipped off. So, Bradley writing a book about how a 30-year-old multi-billionaire who was friends with the Prime Minister, how he masterminded this theft, writing a whole book about it, they gave Joe Low months and months of notice of everything they were going to write. And where did it lead? It gave his legal teams months and months to prepare, and months and months to stop the story really spreading outside the US. So yeah, there's an enormous amount of pre-censorship. I mean, at a defendant media firm, we try and take account of risk appetite. So if you're you don't want even a legal, if you don't even want an angry letter, well, we can advise you to cut everything out. And then newspaper budgets are being cut. There's less and less legal budget to actually fight these cases and to back it up, and so that impacts on editorial decisions. If every story about which results in legal letters or legal proceedings costs a couple £100,000, there's very few newspapers in the country that can stomach that, and even then you need to pick your battles, and so it does have an enormous chilling effect, and there are a lot of stories that don't come to light because of it.
You said an enormous chilling effect. That's quite an extraordinary thing for a legal lawyer, for a media lawyer to say, right?
I think it's true. Yeah. I think it's legal costs. It's the prospect of being facing a trial costing $1.5 million. There just isn't the budget in many news organisations. Even the ones that are portrayed as the big bad guys of the world, working for a lot of the on Fleet Street. We work from campaigning NGOs, freelance journalists, to Fleet Street newspapers, local newspapers, and platforms, and it's a systemic problem. I think there aren't really any news organisations that aren't concerned about legal proceedings, that are just trying to say, what the hell, let's fight it.
I've spoken to American journalists who have said that they, particularly if they have a global footprint, they essentially have to at least take into account UK defamation law and the threat of UK proceedings when they publish things. Is that something? I mean, do you agree with that? Is that something even in the, I mean, I suppose we have this idea that in the US things are better.
Because we have a registered company here that represents us, like Dow Jones UK, we completely have to follow British libel law. We can't just do whatever we want. But I also want to make an observation is, in America, if you get together a bunch of really good journalists, that when they talk about stories they didn't publish, it's usually because they just couldn't find that source. They couldn't nail it. But in the UK, in my experience, you get really great journalists together and they talk about the story that the paper wouldn't publish because of that legal letter or that legal risk. And I think that's really a damaging thing for British society. But I also think it goes hand in hand with some other phenomena that I've noticed in my 2.5 years here. I write a lot about financial crime, well beyond 1MDB. And the one thing I notice interacting with people who may or may not be criminals and their counterparts and associates, is that people aren't afraid in general in the UK. They're not really afraid to even be committing fraud or any financial crime. They think it's actually a pretty reasonable place to do that, because not only do you have this libel law situation, so you can kind of muzzle the newspapers if you need to, the investigators are also hamstrung, because, I mean, for maybe there's good reason, but you know, you don't flip people here on your way up to the top of the crime. So I see it all the time. The FCA, the SFO, they struggle to get the guy at the bottom of the conspiracy, and they can't bring the case. They can't nail it. You know. So they're not afraid of the police or the investigators. When I'm talking about financial crime, I mean, I think violent crime, they'd be afraid. But financial crime, they're not afraid of the police. They're not afraid of the press. Not only that, this is also probably the capital for surveillance in the world. So they're not really afraid of even legal opponents. You know, they got people out there every day around London. There's probably 10 to 20 teams following people around, developing dirt to prevent something from escalating to the next level. So it's really a rosy state of affairs.
Rupert, I'm going to put you on the spot here in 2 stages on the spot here. Our mutual friend we were discussing earlier, I have a good friend who's a media barrister, and I said we were doing this evening, and said, what lawyer are you having? He said, oh, fair enough, Rupert's good. The only thing which he instructed me to say was to make clear that we pointed out that there is a positive side to UK defamation law.
I started my career at a private client firm where predominantly when we did media work, it was representing prospective claimants, people who were concerned about stuff being written about them, and it might have been predominantly privacy actions. And we've got a Rolls-Royce service. It's very, very thorough, our libel system, if you can afford to get to trial. There's something that Claire and I have discussed is as part of her covering this scandal. The Malaysian government openly employed hundreds, if not thousands, of what they would describe as cyber troopers, basically trolls, disinformation people who'd write what the government wanted on blogs, infiltrate comment sections, and rights, and so when you're acting, it comes down to when you've got the right case, when you've got somebody who has genuinely been wronged, that presumption of falsity and not putting the burden on them, of course, is enormously valuable, and helps them achieve their ends. But it's always good to. I found it in my career very, very helpful seeing both sides of the spectrum, and seeing things from both perspectives. Because if you're being trashed by trolls online, and whenever anyone Googles you, a lot of disinformation comes up. Having a rigorous way to address that, a legally enforceable way, is very useful. But I would say, does that rigorous, very effective legal system need to be extended to foreign politicians whose wealth comes from unknown sources? I mean, is that really? Should we be putting restrictions on who can access this effective legal system?
Well, the only people who can access it are the super rich. And I have the dubious privilege of being on both sides of this libel business. As Rupert's pointed out, I've been the butt of vicious disinformation campaigns, which are highly funded by some of our top PR companies, as well as cyber troopers. Bell Pottinger targeted me, a company called FBC. Many PR companies have taken the money. I can't sue. I haven't got any money. I haven't got millions to sue. So what do? I have to just like it or lump it. So this libel law is only for the rich, and we're supposed to be a democracy, frankly. So why have we got a system where only the super rich can clear their name? Why can't I clear my name when there's deliberate, malicious untruths being spread around about me? And you know, so I feel that we really should be addressing that. To be honest, the truth is, this is spread right into the heart of our media, so that major media organizations have responded by doing nasty stories about politicians often, and people who can't really hit back because they don't have the money, and leaving the super rich well alone. And that is troubling because Bradley and I, what is our useful function as journalists? It's really not to go chasing after teachers who have inappropriate relationships or whatever, so much as to hold the powerful to account, because most people aren't able to do that. It's our job to hold the wealthy and the powerful to account, and this law prevents us really from doing it. I would never have been able to have done the 1MDB story if there'd been an editor at my back. The only reason I was able to go after these awful guys was because I decided to do it on my own, and I did it under the radar for the beginning of it. And that troubles me. It troubles me that there aren't stacks of stories like 1MDB out there, because I don't think this is the only kleptocracy case. I think 1MDB is just an exemplar, a rare example of a kleptocracy case which is actually being exposed, and that's because a journalist got on and did it. And I think these sorts of laws are actually very effective in protecting criminals who are over wealthy from being held to account.
Right on. Bradley, do you think we need a free speech provision here, like you have?
Well,
I mean,
it would be nice to have the malice aspect, you know, so that because what you're trying to prevent is you know, really irresponsible journalism. People writing things without checking things with people. If you're going to write something that's really, you know, embarrassing, you want to be checking the facts. I think that's important. So if you had the malice aspect, then you would put a huge obstacle towards these abuses of libel law, and help, you know, prevent good journalism from being muzzled. I think something simple as that. And even in the case of Joe Low, what if you just said, if you're going to bring a libel case in the UK, you have to come. That would be pretty simple, because Joe Low won't be showing up in the UK anytime soon with 2 or 3 red notices for him from Interpol. Authentic red notices, not the unauthentic ones. So I think, you know, this little things like that would make a big difference, I think. Just little things that make it harder for people to be sitting in China without really any business in the UK. I mean, he even sold one of his lingerie business. You know, he's got his other assets are frozen. He doesn't have a reputation to uphold. I mean, to say that anybody's damaged Joe Low's reputation at this point, when the DOJ has, you know, extensively laid out all of the crimes is crazy. You know, so I think just even some small things could help.
Would that be possible? Do you think legally? I mean, let's not say probable, but possible that a legal change like that could happen in this country to, you know, bring in a malice aspect to defamation, or just to try and end this presumption of guilt that we have underpinning the current system?
It would take statute. It would take MPs galvanising to make that sort of change. And I mean, just being realistic, I think, as Claire pointed out, politicians are fair game. They do get a hard time in this country. I think press is pretty good at holding them to account. But so from their perspective, I think they probably think the balance is about right. But
what if we could prove to them that they would get less attention? You know,
yes, we have this.
We have a PowerPoint presentation.
We have a pent-up demand for stories about foreign kleptocrats. We've all got in our inboxes. Yeah. They're just sitting there.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's to bring a wholesale change to defamation law. I mean, the presumption of falsity has been the way it has been in forever in defamation law, and I can't see it happening anytime soon.
Right. Well, so much for that.
But it's also kind of cultural, because I mean, I found in my experience with this book that Australia has a lot of similar laws, but things were done very differently down there. There was less, there was just less of a cultural feel. I think maybe in a way, newspapers and booksellers here have been kind of traumatized by their experience, worse than in other Commonwealth jurisdictions. So that a lot of the fear is internal. One thing we didn't mention about these legal letters is they're almost always bluffing. They're very infrequently are they ready to pursue a case. Like in the case of Joe Low, it would be suicidal for him to pursue a case here. Not only would he lose because of he's got the truth against him and all these different things, his reputation, but also just the discovery process alone would be suicidal for him. He's under criminal investigation. You cannot do civil discovery while you're under criminal investigation unless you want to make it easier for everyone to criminally prosecute you. So I think the other thing is to realize that people are often bluffing, and sometimes these legal letter exchanges can actually be useful for an article. I found because what happens is, let's say you go to someone and you say, I'm going to say X, Y, and Z, and they come back to you and say that's false, and then they have to give a little bit of specificity about why it's false. And if you then go and find out a bit more information, I had this one experience where they were denying something completely, and I came back, I'm like, well, here's the wire transfers and all this, all the evidence, and then they changed their tune. So in a way, they almost confirmed the story for me, in that process. So I think it's not as bad as it looks in the actual reality of it, but the perception is the problem. The perception of the risk.
We've been speaking for about an hour. We are going to have about half an hour more, and I'm hoping that you guys might have a few questions. I can see a question right here at the front. Do we have a microphone anyway? Yes, we do. Austin is the man with the microphone. Can we have this gentleman here at the front? And if you have questions, please make yourself known. Yes?
Hi. Is it? Yeah, you can hear me? Yeah. Sorry if this is a silly question, but it's for Claire, and you said that your two sons are here. Is that them? There? Yeah. So you said there was a spiky-haired man who used to sit next to you and your sons when you were out and about. Yeah. So I assume he was not on your. So I assume he wasn't on your side. The spiky-haired guy.
Well, we had these sorts of incidents. There were a number of them, where you suddenly you sort of notice that they weren't trying to hide the fact that they were following me. I think the point of it was to intimidate me. I think they were deliberately trying to do that, and I tried to ignore it for a long time and pretend that I was dreaming things. And but there was one particular incident where I actually met up with a former Secret Service guy from Malaysia, who we met in a place with a big glass window area with a big extensive outside. And he said, "Claire, I've watched you come up, and you are being followed. Did you realise that?" And so again, I actually ignored that. We carried on, and then I saw this guy filming me through the glass window on this again. So I ran out and I shouted at him. He ran away. So again, and then I had this sense of being followed home that day, because I kind of started getting into sort of movie mode, and I was going around Constitution Hill, and I pretended I was going to go that way, and the big Mercedes that had been seeming to be following me did the same thing, and then I quickly turned, and so did it, and then we came to a halt, and I started photographing at which point it skidded off. Now all of that I would have ignored, except the next day, one of my sort of blogger persecutors wrote in his blog about my meeting, and then I kind of knew that I wasn't imagining it.
So what I was going to carry on saying was, you obviously are very passionate about what you write about, but did it not get to a point where you thought your son's safety or your personal safety meant more to you than this story? So you're sitting there, you think, I'm putting my children and my family in serious danger for a story. Was there ever a point when you just thought, you know what, it's not worth it for them to be in danger for this story, and you just thought, I'm done? Is there ever a time when you thought that?
I hate being bullied, so I'll admit that I was very calculated, and I thought they were trying to frighten me. I think they did frighten my sons, actually, and I think they asked me that question, each of them at one point, and I said to both of them, "You're both over 6 foot. If I can handle it, then so can you," which I don't think was very motherly of me. But we got through it.
Yes, just directly behind you, gentleman with a suit on.
Thanks. Yeah, you've painted a fairly sort of bleak picture of how everybody's cowed here. But one thing you haven't mentioned is the introduction of no-win, no-fee agreements, where people, where law firms act for claimants. Effectively, the law firm takes the risk, and effectively, the claimant, backed by insurance, doesn't then have to suffer the consequences of actually losing the case. And that has led to a lot of cases where even the press have been, have had to admit that they've published some very defamatory stories, and so I think the introduction of conditional fee agreements has rather redressed the balance with regard to these really all-powerful corporations being able to do whatever they like.
Rupert?
Well, the conditional fee agreement scheme was brought in to allow access to justice. So when people do have a very good claim in defamation, and a law firm can see that, they can get redress against big organizations. Now, just until literally a week ago, the risk that a law firm was taking by entering into a CFA, as they're called, meant that they could, if they were successful, the courts recognized the law firm taking a risk, and they could double their legal fees. The Mirror challenged whether that was compatible with free speech, expensive law fees being effectively doubled at the end of the case back in 2011, and it was held to be incompatible. And so they've just been, that doubling up of legal fees has just been phased out. But I would agree with you that there needs to be a fair balance between the right to reputation and the right to free speech. Every democracy is looking to find that balance. We're coming from a context of very powerful, wealthy foreign people with very little reputation here, suing impecunious journalists and freelancers and keeping stories down. But you're absolutely right. There is, of course, a lot of powerful organizations there, and they often put out misinformation, and so yeah, CFAs I think where a law firm can see there's merits in a case, it's good that these no win no fee agreements can allow access to justice.
Ewan, I think, do you have a microphone?
Thank you very much, everyone. Ewan Grant, I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst. In previous incarnation as a VAT inspector, I once allowed as a deductible a Carter Rock libel invoice against somebody who was defending themselves against a claim of being a KGB agent. At a wedding in Kuala Lumpur last year, the imam was an hour late because he was moonlighting, and while we were waiting, most of that hour was spent, as far as I was concerned, by being asked about 1MDB. That's how big it was, and that was the bride's father and brother and uncle. Two quick questions, particularly for Rupert. The first one, how encouraged or disappointed are you by the presence of lawyers here tonight? And secondly, for Claire, given just how enormously important across the board 1MDB is, how encouraged are you by, or discouraged by British civil society, and indeed European civil society, in paying attention to your book and your campaign? Because really, I don't think there's much more important than this. It's got everything. Thank you.
Rupert, thoughts about
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, I think it's very good if any lawyers here.
Please come along to all Kleptoscopes, the more the merrier.
Yeah, No, I mean healthy debate's a good thing.
Do you think that UK European civil society has paid this enough attention?
Well,
will
no.
be for sale here later.
Yeah, good. No, and I think the main reason for that is it's been so very hard to get newspapers to take up the story. And for that's one of the reasons I'm so grateful that Bradley's paper, the Wall Street Journal, did come in. It was one of the early papers to come in, and has been the bravest in pursuing this story and making it its own. And the reason why major newspapers didn't do the story was because they were being hounded by these kleptocrats lawyers. The first story I did was in early 2015, and this was about the initial 1.83 billion, that was funneled out of the fund, and into Joe Low's bank account, 700 million went. And I had all of this, I'd got it all from data, it was all solid, and I'd given my copy of the data, a copy of it to the Times. And the Sunday Times had got ready with a really big story. They were thinking that they may get a front page and then 2 more pages, and they put top journalist onto it. And just as the week started to peter out, they got back to me, and that journalist said, I actually can't remember having such big pushback. We've got 6 of London's top law firms hammering away at us. It's just such an expensive exercise. Now, they did, they put it onto Foreign, and it was a good story, and it validated what I wrote. But that was it. I don't think the Sunday Times have not touched the story again, and nor did, eventually the Guardian took it up and did the story about the false policeman and the basic UK angle. But that took them, I think, 5 months of fighting with different sets of lawyers before the paper was finally willing to do. And the way they did it was by making it a long read. So you had to read 7,000 words, because by going into it at such length, it kind of sort of made it impossible to go after them.
I write long reads too. It's amazing what we can hide in them.
Yes.
We have very male questions so far. Any female questions before we go on with? No, come on, there must be someone. No, all right, men back. Oh yes. Going to pounce on you, as it were.
I was going to ask another lawyerly question. If you were to make a change to defamation law in the UK, what would it be?
Something needs to be done about costs. They're just out of control. Yeah, the system would be not perfect, but it would be pretty good if there wasn't 5, 10, 15,000 pounds being incurred so rapidly at the start of every case. So it's something that media lawyers from and judges and are all engaged with at the how do we make this more efficient? How do we make it more cost effective? How do we cap costs at an early stage? I would also say, reversing the presumption of falsity. You get in foreign jurisdictions like Canada, you get something called an anti-SLAP motion, which is, SLAP stands for, I think, strategic litigation against public policy, but effectively, really abusive cases, which I would argue that the case Claire faced from Malaysia was, which are effectively designed to chill. You can go in there and get a judge to look at that right at the start. If you think this is an abusive litigation, you can bring a motion to get the whole thing dismissed at the start. The problem is it's this 2-year wait to trial, with so much uncertainty and so much cost that you need to be able to put everything on the line to fight all that way, and it's a massive game of chicken of who will blink first. So, a couple ideas.
Yes, about the.
Yes, it's a question for Claire. Did I hear correctly that your book is for sale in this country? I've certainly seen it on Amazon, and from what I saw skimming through it, it does name quite a few names. So I just wonder whether you got away with that. And the other question is a follow-up on these spiky-haired men that were following you around. I mean, people were being found dead in Kuala Lumpur. At least one of the prosecutors was. You had a very reasonable case that you were in quite a lot of danger. What was the response from the British authorities to that? And also specifically on the Interpol case, did you get any support from the Metropolitan Police about the Interpol thing when the red notice came out for you?
Well, it was all a bit exotic for Belgravia Police Station. And, there was a queue of people behind me wanting to report stolen purses and things, and they were, well, where is Malaysia? And I actually brought Patrick along with me because I knew they'd think I was a mad middle-aged woman. But I had to go in because, once I'd realised that, all this intimidation was genuine, I did obviously have to consider that I might find myself, in the Thames or something, or accidentally on a tube line or something. It obviously was on my mind a lot at that particular time. So I said to them, look, I just want to give you my statement. So if I do end up dead in the next 2 weeks, you've got it written down. I think it was the Malaysians. And in the end, we stuck it out, didn't we? And then an inspector came down, and I got to put in my report. And yes, in the end, I think a call may have been made to the Malaysian embassy, because the bloggers, not too long after that, had said that I'd used my connections to protect myself. So I think they had done something, which was much appreciated, and this all did fall away. And yes. My publisher is a very small publisher, unlike Bradley's, who's one of the biggest, but neither of them were going to face having to publish it against these threats. So I thought about it, and I thought, well, I don't think JLO is going to come to British court either and pursue this case. I think he's bluffing. So I opened my own publishing concern. And we re-stickered all the books with my new imprint, and it is now available in the United Kingdom under Lost World Press.
In this very room.
And you can buy a book in this room.
Right? You have
yes,
some,
you'd be hard put to find a bookshop that wants to stock it, but
I have a copy. I recommend it highly. I didn't know why it had a sticker. There you go. That all has now become clear. There is a gentleman here at the front. Oh, sorry. Oh, yes, there you go. Yes.
Thanks. This is more for Bradley. I just, it seems like every day there's a story about banks getting fined for, or being under investigation for facilitating money laundering, breaching sanctions, etc. It's obviously a big issue for the banking sector, and one of the surprises I had from reading your and Tom's book was just how much of this money was flowing through law firms. And you talked about that a little bit earlier. I just wonder, do you think, that seems like a big anomaly now in terms of how much money seems to be able to flow through law firms without much consequence. Is that sustainable, do you think? Is anything going to be done about that?
Well, that's a good question. I have found that law enforcement people are one of the groups that are just aghast. No law firm is getting hit with any case. There are some cases, that thing I described where you use this IOTA account. There have been a few law firms that have a guy's gotten arrested, but they were usually some small Miami guy that was doing it for drug, money laundering or something. But the big firms, they know exactly what to do. It's almost impossible to catch a lawyer. No offense, and because they know exactly what they got to do in order to make this thing work, And so so how does let's say for theoretical purposes, how does a international thief pay his lawyers? Well, it's not that hard. Maybe they even tell you how to do it. They'll figure out. Oh, look, do you have any friends that might have their own money? Well, do you want to give them a loan? And then I think.
Wasn't even paying legal fees. This was actually.
I know. I was conflating a bit, but yeah, I think. To be honest, it's a bit shocking to me that the law firms themselves haven't taken it up as as the representatives of the law. the bar or something like that haven't taken it up as a big issue, because it's pretty scary to see $100 million go into this account and go there, and they didn't do any checks on it. Now, actually, it's not entirely clear that any law firm knew exactly what was going on in this case, but I think there's the thing that's funny. Why do we know about 1MDB? Well, there's been great work by people like Claire, but also the people involved in 1MDB were really sloppy. I mean, these were not the best. They weren't the cream of the crop of money launderers. And if journalists can figure out a money laundering scandal, then you've made a bunch of big mistakes, because there are people to help you prevent that from happening. You just didn't hire them early enough, One of my favorite ones is that Joe Low, when he first started his, in his mid-20s, setting up these offshore accounts in the Seychelles, he thought, the Seychelles, it's a bearer share jurisdiction where, in order to prove ownership, you have to have an actual paper copy. But while he was off partying, he didn't realize that they got rid of bearer shares in the Seychelles, and they put his name in the registry. So all the companies had his name suddenly emblazoned, in their registry. So that's one of the small examples of how the whole thing kind of came tumbling apart. But
on the American, as I understand it, U.S. lawyers, unusually their financial transactions with clients are covered by privilege, so they don't have to report them if they have suspicions about them, unlike lawyers in most jurisdictions.
Yeah, and also here they have the money laundering aspect. In the U.S. they don't have that.
Yeah, so it's funny, I was talking to a contact in one of the famous tax havens, and quite a high-ranking official yesterday, and he's furious about this. It's funny, he's just absolutely furious about the fact that the US has effectively imposed all this transparency on all the tax havens, but not imposed it on itself. In fact, Global Witness did this whole amazing investigation when they had secretly filmed a load of lawyers essentially advising them how to hide money, including the head of the American Bar Association.
And what's kind of crazy in this case is there's no limit to your spending, right? Like, so, okay, everyone deserves a good lawyer, but in this case, is there no limit to the number of lawyers and the number of people that they in turn hire? Joe Low's legal apparatus per year is certainly above $25 million a year spending on that. That's like money to the reputation guys, who in turn hire PR people and digital firms that clean up his things. He's got this law firm that's overseeing everything, who in turn hired Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, Mark Kasowitz, Trump's personal lawyer, Bobby Birchfield, one of his other lawyers, another senior guy, and then he's also got all the money going to these people like Elliot Broidy, who are doing lobbying for him. But there's just no limit. He's supposed to be defending himself, okay, but that seems like he's going a little overboard.
I would highly recommend Joe Low's website when you get home tonight.
Oh, is it good? I've not looked.
Yeah, it's very slick.
JoeLow.com?
Yeah.
Something like that, yeah. Actually, you should read that so that you can balance out your views. We're obviously,
He does regret a few indiscretions of his youth, but does he not?
Well, don't we all, though?
Yes, the odd
there.
billion that he might not have.
Yes, there's a gentleman just here. Sorry, I'm rather favouring people on the aisle. Sorry about this.
It's just a follow-up of the banking scandal. The gentleman there. My question would be directed at especially Mr. Bradley, because it might involve the U.S. jurisdictions. What would happen if, what would you recommend, or your advice is, to a small retailer, a couple of million, being cheated by a huge big whale, Swiss bank, in violation of their own law, perjured to at least false statement to the U.S. Senate that they never covered up for their employees, but they did. In violation of international the Wolfsburg anti-money laundering law and the local New York and federal state laws, including Swiss laws, Malaysian law, as well as Singapore law. But they have been blocking me all the way for many years. I can't do anything. And if I were to go approach any press, all the press will run away from me, just like.
This sounds like a question with a lot of hinterland.
Yeah, no, I wish I had an easy answer. I don't actually. I think when you have a case like that, you have to just pursue every avenue. If whether it's bringing your own lawsuits or notifying law enforcement or trying journalists. There must be someone out there that would be interested in looking into it. but I wish I had an easier answer for you. I don't think there's a shortcut on that one. You know, I think it's just, it sounds like you're running a marathon and maybe you're only halfway done. So.
Yes, it's very difficult. They block me in every jurisdictions. They fight all the way to the highest court. They block here, block there, and it's terrible. Yes.
Sounds terrible.
You need a friendly blogger who'd be prepared to report on your subject. Yes, there's a lady right at the back.
Hi, I used to work for the Wall Street Journal in China, and there were problems with being able to publish stuff sometimes that we had to think about. But I was just curious to know, beyond journalists who are sometimes facing challenges, or investigators who might have their own obstacles, what do you see as other possible ways to hold power to account? Is it scope for artists or scientists, or somehow improving the moral fiber generally? I don't know, just curious to know beyond, because not to say that we don't keep fighting for better laws to support journalists who traditionally need to be holding power to account, but beyond that, I was curious to know about other avenues.
That's an interesting question. How do you, beyond just getting information out into the public domain, how do you, the rot has gone pretty deep in it, the political class and around 1MDB and so on. How do you try and repair that damage?
Well, I suppose, I do think that our democracy is far more threatened than most of us sort of think about as we go about our daily lives. I do think part of that is because the press isn't able to do its job here. I think really it's each individual getting active. It's each of us remembering that perhaps we should actively support the constituency association for whichever party we are part of, so that it isn't dominated by real oddballs who turn up at the meetings and then elect the most weird people to be their representatives in Parliament. Those sorts of things.
It's a very, very good point.
Yeah, it's down to each and every one of us to perhaps be more active and conscious of what being part of a democracy involves than we have been. I think we've been a bit lazy.
We've got time for one last question. And yeah, there's a gentleman right on the aisle again. Sorry. Yeah, no pressure. Let's make it a really good one.
I'm not going to live up to that billing, I don't think. Well, it's just a really simple, probably really dumb question, probably for Rupert as much as anything else. Like, how is this even sustainable, this sort of single nation, libel setup? Because, obviously, so you can't get the physical book here, but, a lot of the stuff that Bradley wrote was in the newspaper already. That's still searchable. I can read it now if I want to. The intro was published in the journal, right? The first chapter.
You can get the physical book if you buy it from a US site.
Yeah, okay, so you can even get it as well. Yeah. But what is even the point of spending the time and the effort of trying to scare a lot of bookstores not to sell it when, you can get, and there was a PDF of the book floating around as well, right? For a while. You can get, actually I shouldn't say that. You can't get You should pay for the book.
We deleted all those.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But anyway, the point is that the information is very widely available. It's like you're not stopping the information, so what are you achieving other than frustrating the commercial success of Bradley and publishing?
Well, yeah, that's absolutely right. Goods. There's a term of art in reputation management, as it's called, which is the Streisand effect, which is when you try and shut people up, it's the risk, and it's a strong risk of making the story 10 times bigger. And I'm absolutely sure that the foreign politician who sued Claire about a small paragraph at the bottom of a blog, which on a website that was banned in Malaysia, his whole party is under criminal investigation now. He regrets that. He's made the story 10 times bigger. And, it's easier than ever for information to be shared. And so, the people who often the kleptocrats, it's hard to get any statistics on who's getting away with it and not, but it often backfires, and it's a real risk that when you threaten a publication and on occasions they do stand up. When a claim fails and a book is published, you've given it massive publicity. So
I counter that, though. The thing about the Streisand effect is we know it because we know it. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are an enormous number of not Streisand effects out there that don't have a name because we don't know them. I mean, there's a sort of Rumsfeldian unknown unknowns.
Yeah.
I would say to counter it with the Rafael de Moraes effect, who is a friend of mine in Angola, who published an article on his blog. He was contacted by Shillings, who he told them to sod off. All he had was a kitchen table and they could try and take it away from him if they wanted, and he'd write on the floor. He then contacted all the English language publications in Africa that run his articles. He is no longer published in English anywhere in Africa. So, you know, there are a lot of Raphaels out there. You know, one guy writing articles about the powerful on his kitchen table who we can no longer read about because of the likes of Shillings. So I think the reason why people spend money on Shillings and the others is because it works. Sadly.
I think in this case it didn't actually work. I think this whole campaign of writing to bookstores and stuff, it really, what it did was justify the fees, you know, that they were charging the client. In this case, you can't help Joe Low at this point with his reputation. You know, there's nothing you can do. You know, you can write letters to everybody you want. I don't think it'll make any difference. I mean, I think they have had zero impact on preserving or you know, ameliorating his reputation, but they want to keep justifying their work, and they have to do something, I guess. And I do think, though, in this case that it hasn't worked at all. But I think you're right. I think it's the cases you've never heard about are the ones where it worked.
I mean, I think one of the really alarming things is we hear a lot about Russian money and the threats to the British economy from Russian money. In terms of volume, there is much less Russian money than there is Chinese money. You never, ever hear about the owners of that money, full stop, at all. And, you know, it's a whole giant unknown out there somewhere, and one of the reasons we don't hear about it is because of this. Anyway, on that cheerful note, thank you for coming. Buy Claire's book. And thank you, Bradley, and thank you, Rupert, and thank you, all of you. Come to the next Kleptoscope. Where is yours?